Hi everyone, welcome back to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm Go Local News editor Kate Nagel. It's not every day you have a former New York Times science editor talking about her new book. This is Cornelia Dean. Thank you for joining us in studio today.
Thank you.
Making sense of science, separating substance from spin, which seeks to equip non-scientists, this will help me out quite a bit, with a set of critical tools to evaluate the scientific claims and controversies that shape our lives. Talk with us about this. Your time at the New York Times, when did you decide to write this book?
Oh, I've been working on this book for a long time. I was distracted by another book, by all kinds of other things, but I suppose I would say in the presidency of George W. Bush, where we saw quite a lot of the kinds of things that we're seeing now with President Trump. I'm thinking in particular about the muzzling of the EPA. In the George W. Bush administration, those people had a real hard time, and a lot of them, in my opinion, did heroic work to keep their research efforts going in the face of not even just lack of support, but outright opposition from the administration. And then, as now, the issue was climate change. They didn't want to say that climate change was for real, which, of course, it is. So, anyway, unfortunately, there's no shortage of material for a book like this. So the subject matter of this book ranges in all kinds of different directions. Cell phones and brain cancer, vaccines, you name it. There, food, medicine, there are many, many, many areas that it talks about.
So I'm sure you go, yes, as you said, you go into a number of different avenues. But one of the things that really intrigued me about the intro was, again, equipping that non-scientist, the average person with those tools. There's so much information out there, and there's so much misinformation out there. I mean, in this era that you can go on, try to self-diagnose yourself, try to find more information. I mean, what's your advice to people as they're trying to, sift through so much data that's out there and what's right and what's not?
Well, I think the crucial question is, if you're not a scientist yourself, and maybe even if you are, because the research enterprise today is so highly specialized that people in one area don't know about what's going on in another area. So it's very hard to say that anybody is an expert across the board anymore because there's too much specialization. But my advice is to try to find sources of information that you think are reliable. And I have a section in the book on how to read research studies and how to tell who's an expert and who isn't an expert and that kind of thing. But if you can find a news organization or a physician or whoever it is that you have confidence in, that kind of gives you a little leg up in the thought process. It can be difficult. The other thing, and the book talks about this also, is to identify ideas that are science-based and ideas that are not science-based, but are dressed up to look like science. And there are a lot of them around. Climate denial is dressed up to look like it's a scientific idea, but it's not. Creationism is the foremost example of that, the opposition to the teaching of evolution. The creationist movement, they have a whole branch called the theory of intelligent design, which dresses itself up to look as if it's a scientific idea, but it's not. It's a religious idea. It may actually be correct, but it's not scientific. It's not a science.
We'll only find out at the final day.
At the last
when it's too late.
Judgment, yes.
So talk with us about the reception about this so far. We're at the New York Times. You're used to a lot of feedback from folks. What have you heard from folks about this book?
That people think it's very timely, and that it's pulling together a lot of information that it's necessary for people to have now, and that's actually gratifying when I hear people say that, because I feel like as a society we're facing a lot of questions that are really knotty, really difficult questions, and they should not be answered by some group of eggheads in a closed room somewhere. They're topics that we should be talking about as a society. One is we have very powerful new tools of genetic manipulation. And there should be a wide discussion about what kinds of uses of this technology are we okay with, and what kinds of uses, if any, do we want to say, you know what, we don't want to go there. There's another area of research that's called geoengineering, which is using techniques of engineering to alter Earth's climate to counteract the effects of global warming. That's a very interesting and potentially very disruptive technology. And before anybody starts to put that kind of stuff into effect, I think there should be a wider discussion of it. Researchers are working now on autonomous battlefield robots. And probably many people know we have drones that fly around there directed by people in an Air Force base in Nevada or, various places. But these would be robots that make their own decisions without any human intervention. It's a very interesting idea. Some people say it might actually reduce the incidence of misbehavior on the battlefield, because the robot would never get tired or angry or sad or whatever. However, that to me is another question that should be answered by a wider discussion. These things are going to be acting in our names, and we need to know about them. But people don't. One of the things I hope to accomplish in the book is to give people a kind of a basis so that they could participate in that kind of a conversation.
Do you think a lot of those conversations sort of happen at a kind of a pure academic level, conferences of that nature, sort of the researchers who are involved in it, but might not have trickled down again to the average person?
I think that the research community, and my previous book is about this idea, I think the research community does not feel much of an obligation to relate to ordinary people. And my view is that they have an affirmative obligation of citizenship to participate in public debates, but it's not part of their job description, and the tools to do it effectively are not in their skill set. And so
is that where the press comes in and authors come in?
In theory, yes, but excuse me.
No worries. I was looking at the book here, and I like looking at the cover because it took me a second. I said, "Oh, it's the shell game."
It's the shell game. That's right. It's the shell game.
Watching them go around, and it's sort of, you play the games, you go to the ballpark, you see it on the big screen, but it's, if you take your eye off a shell for a second, might not be knowing what you're getting under there.
It's very true. But anyway, I think there needs to be a much greater conversation between the research community and members of the public. But we're in a place now with our political situation where conversations of almost any kind are very difficult. They're problem-plagued. And I don't know, this book and the previous book are my little efforts to try and help that situation a bit.
So one of the things we talked about before you came on was Rhode Island was sort of ground zero recently about the EPA scientists sort of not being allowed to talk at a climate change conference. It turns out, we Go Local is oftentimes an EcoRI in here, and one of their reporters, Tim Faulkner, reported there's going to be a forum. It's kind of an alternative forum. But, are scientists at this juncture, especially if they're working for the government, that they're in between that proverbial rock and a hard place? Okay, so maybe they can go and speak at the alternative one, but how much do they fear that their livelihood or their career might be at stake?
I think a lot of them, when they do speak out, are being very brave because, in fact, maybe their career is threatened. If they're not, going to be fired outright, maybe they won't be promoted, maybe they'll be moved to something they don't want to do, that kind of thing. But so I think there are a lot of heroic researchers in the federal government who are continuing to work, and also there were a lot of people who just collected data and put the data in a safe place where it could not be sabotaged. And that also, I think, is useful. And we at the Times, it was not, unusual to have people call us and say, I can't speak openly or, whatever. because they trust us. I guess, I hope, I'm assuming that's why they are willing to talk to us. But if they're in a very difficult situation, and I give them a lot of credit for sticking to their jobs and keeping on, because the federal government is a major source of research that produces the data that people need in order to make good decisions. If you don't have good data about the state of the world, you will not make good decisions.
So, come from the journalism world, I've written books before, and throughout the process, I'm probably sure you have an idea of what it is that you're going to be writing about, but did the book kind of bring anything out that you didn't realize you were going to be touching upon at the outset?
Oh, I'm trying to think. Actually, what was frustrating to me were all of the things that kind of fell onto the cutting room floor.
There was more. You wanted more.
Yeah, there's plenty more that could be said. But no, I made a list of the major topics that I wanted to hit, and I think I hit them. I just want this to be a useful guide for people who are interested in these kinds of questions, but don't want to be misled by people who are either misinformed or uninformed or are deliberately lying to us.
So there's some reviews on the back of the book that I can share with you here. If you want the facts laid down in a simple, unfussy style, I can see that. Then get a copy of Am I Making Myself Clear? This book should sit on the shelf of every scientist, science communicator, and university press officer. I've never read a better, more thorough guide to science communication in all its forms. Another one of
That was a nice review.
by Geoengineering of Nature. Dean's wisdom, especially for engaging in the political arena, is delivered with a mix of authority and charm. Ought to be required reading in all science graduate programs. I think that's sort of the last question is just there's the research component, and then it's never done in a vacuum. I mean, how much is politics involved in scientific research?
Yeah, so I have sections in the book about the influence of politics and the influence of money. And
two very big influencers.
Yeah, and they're very big influences. And for a long time, the federal government was the major source of research funding in the United States, and that has shifted in recent years, and so private money is taking more of a part, which means that private money is often deciding what is going to be studied and what's not going to be studied. And as one of the people I quote in the book says, if you are talking about pest control and your funding is coming from a big agribusiness company, it's not going to be interested in funding research on organic methods.
We can say Monsanto here.
Well, they're going to be their interest is not in organic agriculture; it's in chemically aided agriculture. So that kind of thing is an issue. If pharmaceutical research is financed by pharmaceutical companies, they're going to be more interested in the next anti-balding blockbuster drug than they are maybe in something to treat some important but not necessarily profitable disease. So all of these questions are important. And then, of course, politics.
Oh, the politics.
So we have... Oh, I'm sorry.
No, take your time. I get it myself. I was out for a week because I wasn't allowed in the studio because I was... It happens.
Anyway, climate is the major...
Major political, yes.
800-pound gorilla of politicized science, but the teaching of evolution is as well. All kinds of questions like that.
That are raised in Cornelia Dean's book. I'm going to let her go around the corner here and let her friend Bob Witt come into the studio. I was going to drill her about their relationship having gone back years from the journalism world. But Cornelia Dean, I appreciate your taking the time to come in. No, I want you to feel better. But again, making sense of science, separating substance from spin. Former New York Times science editor Cornelia Dean, thank you for coming in.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.